Welcome back, survivor. If you can hear this, it means you're still alive. This is Jack's Nightmares, and this is your next story. There was never a formal announcement. No general order came down. No final encrypted transmission. The last real signal we got from the mainland was on day 64. Just coordinates and a fragmented broadcast loop from Pacific Command. After that, nothing. We ran diagnostics. We tried everything from high-gain burst to scatter-wave bounce off the upper layers. We double-checked keys, swept for jamming. We even rotated the long-range antenna by hand in case the servos were misaligned. Nothing came back. Not from Hawaii, not from San Diego, not even from 18th Air Force up at McCord. Every frequency that used to carry our lifeblood was empty. Not silent, just wrong. Some of the crew kept asking if we were under MCON. Others thought we'd missed a satellite pass or key rotation. I didn't tell them what I suspected. I waited 3 more days. Then I had the comms officer pull archived message traffic, change the time codes, and push a new log entry to the leadership terminals. It looked like a relay from Joint Command. Said we were still in holding pattern, still authorized to conduct limited recon, still tasked with maintaining order in the Pacific. That message was the first lie I told. By then, our numbers had already cratered. We had sailed with about 4,800. We were down to roughly 2,200 on paper, fewer at any given muster. Some jumped. Some drank themselves into silence. Some vanished in lower compartments we sealed and never reopened. I told the lie because a ship this big cannot run on rumors and grief. I gave a copy to the XO and told her I'd gotten it through an unscheduled burst window. She didn't press. She just nodded and asked what the orders said. I told her we were to continue operations, keep the crew functional, and wait for further directives. She said, "Aye, sir," and didn't bring it up again. That was how I knew she understood what I was doing. This ship was built to project power across oceans. The Gerald R Ford-class carrier wasn't just a floating runway. It was a small city, a reactor-driven war machine with electromagnetic catapults, twin reactors, and enough missiles on board to start a regional war. We launched with a full strike group during a scheduled readiness exercise. We had our destroyers, our oiler, and full magazines. When the outbreak began, we were 200 nautical miles off Hawaii. At first, we thought it was just another containment issue, maybe a bioterror scare. There were classified briefs moving up and down the chain, but nothing alarming, at least not openly. Then, Hawaii stopped responding. Then, San Diego. Then everything. We burned fuel trying to raise the fleet. We lost a helicopter to an engine failure over Wake Island. No one retrieved the crew. We couldn't risk it. One of our Arleigh Burke-class escorts ignored orders and broke formation trying to get back to Pearl. We never heard from them again. The oiler stayed with us, but only after I had a Marine team physically board her and secure the bridge. Their captain had already hanged himself in his cabin. By day 100, I knew no one was coming to relieve me. The world was falling apart. The infection had made it to the mainland, then spread through everything else like fire through brush. We knew the basics. Transmission came from blood exposure, bite, deep laceration, or contact with infected tissue. It took hours, sometimes a day, before symptoms showed. Early stages looked like fever. Then came the changes. Unresponsive pupils, erratic movement, aggression. Anyone who died without major structural trauma reanimated. Fully, no heartbeat, no respiratory rhythm, just movement. Purposeful, violent. We lost over 1,000 personnel in the first 2 months. Not from infection. Most never even set foot on land. They cracked under the weight of silence. Some jumped. Some took pills. Some went into the lower compartments and never came back up. Others tried to leave. It started as whispers in the air wing. Flight crews were rotating off ready status and spending more time alone. The chain of command felt too stiff, too artificial. Pilots hated waiting. So did ordnance techs. There was a story going around, unconfirmed but believable, that some of the islands north of Midway were still clear. One of the helo crews wanted to break off and head there. Aviation Maintenance Chief Fuller was the one who brought it up during a quiet night watch. He told 2 of his men that the north side hangar door had an override switch, and the helos prepped for emergency response were barely tied down. He said if they fueled fast, they could get into the air before anyone responded. He said I had no legal command authority since the Pentagon no longer existed. Unfortunately for him, one of the sailors he talked to had just lost a brother during a rooftop evac op in Honolulu. That sailor didn't want the ship to fall. He came to the XO. She came to me. I didn't throw anyone overboard. Not then. We arrested Fuller, put him in the brig, and interrogated him with the ship's legal officer present. He didn't deny it. Said he had the right to survive. Said we were all just pretending anyway. That was the word he kept using. Pretending. I had the Master-at-Arms assign 2 Marines to his cell full-time. After 30 days, we rotated him into mess duty with restrictions. He peeled root vegetables for 2 months straight under guard. No tools sharper than a spoon. No talking to aircrew. But the seed was already planted. That was the week I began reading the daily messages over the 1MC like they came from Upchain. I copied the formatting, used the old templates. I referenced standing orders and reauthorization of long-range recon by fictional task forces. I named real locations: Naval Station Rota, Diego Garcia, Joint Base Elmendorf, to make it all sound credible. I signed off using codes we hadn't received in months. I even started issuing fake QRA orders to keep the pilots sharp. Told them the 18th Air Wing had made contact in Alaska and needed top cover evac in the Aleutians. I let them plan it out, full mission profiles. The crew treated it like the real thing. The mask held. You want to know why? Because routine matters more than hope. Hope breaks when it's tested. Routine just keeps going. You wake up, you eat, you stand your watch. You clean your rifle, you fuel your bird. You answer the same 6 status reports and pretend your captain still takes orders from someone above him. There are only 2 reasons this carrier still floats. The first is the reactors. We have 2. They're still hot. We baby them. We rotate techs, limit stress cycles, watch every gauge like it's sacred. Without those reactors, we are just a hulk in the water. The second reason is the mask. I do not lie because I enjoy it. I lie because structure holds. As long as I wear this rank, as long as I read those orders over the speaker system, as long as we fly 1 bird per day and log it like it matters, we remain a functioning ship. I told the XO the truth 6 weeks ago. She said she already knew. She still salutes me every morning. That's how you know it works. The following days blended into each other the way life at sea always does, but now there was a sharpness to every detail. Every sound mattered. Every shadow on the radar scope meant another decision that might keep us alive, or might tear the crew apart. I learned to read people the same way I used to read charts. You could tell by the way someone carried himself on deck whether he believed in the routine, or whether he was slipping. Most of the time, slipping meant looking for an excuse to break off, to find a raft, a helicopter, anything that could take him toward land, even if land was nothing but rot and death. Our daily schedule kept the ship breathing. At 0600 we raised colors. The band had been reduced to a single petty officer with a bugle, but he blew the notes sharp enough to echo off the island tower. After that, breakfast, powdered eggs, canned beans, or stale bread. By 0730, divisions mustered for their checks. Aviation crews inspected birds. Engineering kept eyes on gauges. Reactor techs rotated in and out of sealed compartments. Marines posted to armories rotated to keep themselves awake. It wasn't glamorous, but if any part of that chain broke, the entire ship would have followed. On day 381, the tension broke surface again. A pair of ordnance handlers tried to trade 2 rifles for access to the brig so they could speak with Fuller, the same chief who had planned the helicopter theft months before. The guards reported it immediately, and I pulled the handlers into a private hearing that night. They claimed they only wanted to hear him out, that he had information on safe landings and coordinates for a clear island. They were lying, and everyone in the room knew it. I docked their rations, pulled them off weapons duty, and reassigned them to sanitation detail for 30 days. It was harsh, but fair. I learned quickly that harsh but fair was the only way left. The infection outside didn't care about mercy. On land, those things wandered through every city we had once sworn to defend. In the beginning, some reports suggested they were slow, shambling, broken by decay. But on the islands, our helo crews saw faster ones too. Survivors described them as twitching, restless, darting in bursts like predators. Whether it was mutation or just different stages of rot, I never knew. What mattered was simple. Exposure killed, bites guaranteed reanimation, and once dead, the human body became something entirely focused on ripping the living apart. By this point, more than half the world was gone. Maybe more. The sea had become a dumping ground for the remains of freighters, tankers, cruise liners. Most floated empty, stripped by survivors who had tried to make homes out of them before the infection or starvation finished the job. We learned to approach them cautiously. A drifting ship might hold fresh water tanks and canned stores, or it might be packed tight with the walking dead, waiting in silence until we cut the hatches open. Marines learned to clear by sound, metal taps on the hull, listening for echoes that didn't belong. The Gerald R Ford remained alive because we kept discipline. 2 nuclear reactors gave us unlimited power, but everything else was finite. Arresting cables wore thin, tires for aircraft degraded, filters in the desalinators cracked from salt buildup. We rationed every part, every bolt, every cable. Cannibalization became routine. We stripped one Hornet down to the frame so another could fly. We pulled memory modules from disabled radar to patch the Hawkeye. Even the galley tore down old refrigeration compressors and rebuilt them twice over to keep what little fresh food we had left edible. By day 385, the rumor spread that we had made contact with Diego Garcia. That lie hadn't come from me. Someone in communications had taken a faint static burst and turned it into a fantasy. I confronted the section chief and demanded to know why the story had gotten legs. He admitted he wanted to give people something to hope for. I told him plainly, hope could be poison if it wasn't tied to something real. He stood at attention, eyes burning, but he didn't argue. I had him restricted to quarters for 2 weeks. From that day forward, every intercepted signal passed through me before reaching the crew. The XO understood what I was doing better than anyone. She knew the mask mattered more than truth. She never smiled, never joked, but she stood shoulder to shoulder with me when I read out the tasking messages from Joint Command. She even added her own flourishes, reminders about checklists, orders for mock drills, evaluations for divisions. It made the whole machine look functional. In a way, it was functional. Sailors needed orders. Without them, there was only the void. Still, I felt the ship starting to split. Younger sailors began carving their own stories. Some believed the mainland was rebuilding. Others swore that an island fortress existed near Guam, defended by Marines and untouched by infection. And there were the dark ones, who muttered that the infection had spread to the water itself, that anything dead beneath the waves could come crawling back. I shut those talks down fast. Superstition could kill faster than disease. The first real mutiny attempt since Fuller came on day 392. A group of 15 sailors, led by a bosun's mate, tried to breach one of the aft magazines. Their plan was simple: grab rifles and grenades, overpower the Marines, and take a helicopter. They didn't count on the XO catching the scent early. She ordered the Marines to lock down every hatch leading aft. When the group realized they were cornered, they tried bluffing, claiming they only wanted extra arms for defense drills. Their bluff didn't last. We court-martialed the ringleader and 2 of his closest men. The rest we broke into smaller working parties and scattered across the ship. That way, none of them had enough allies close by to try again. That night, I walked the length of the flight deck alone. I stared at the sea and listened to the low hum of the reactors pushing steady power into the veins of this floating city. I thought about what it meant to execute a sailor for mutiny. I had authorized 1 death already, back when an engineer threatened to bring down the entire reactor plant just to prove we were pretending. I had never forgotten the way the firing squad stood afterward, stoic on the outside, broken behind their eyes. We couldn't afford to repeat that lightly, but we also couldn't afford to show weakness. If order died here, thousands of tons of steel would sink with it, and every person aboard would drown or be eaten alive when landfall came. The next morning, I doubled down on the mask. I read an order claiming that Pacific Command had confirmed secure zones along the west coast of the United States. I gave exact grid coordinates. They were meaningless, numbers copied from an old training manual, but they sounded official. I saw heads lift in the mess decks that day. I saw sailors eating slower, like they wanted to savor the thought of going home. It was cruel in one sense, but necessary in another. If the crew broke entirely, the Gerald R. Ford would become nothing more than another ghost ship drifting in silence. We sent a recon flight to Pearl Harbor the following week. 2 Hornets went up, loaded with drop tanks and cameras. They came back with images that still sit in the pit of my stomach. The runways were choked with wreckage, bodies stacked in long lines along the piers. Fires had burned entire blocks black. No movement, no signals, only death frozen under the Hawaiian sun. When I showed the pictures to the XO, she didn't flinch. She just said, "We won't show these to the crew. Not yet." That became our routine for months. I lied, the XO reinforced, and the crew followed. It wasn't noble. It wasn't even close to the Navy I had served for 3 decades, but it kept us afloat, and afloat was all we had left. Eventually, the routine wasn't enough. Our stores had dipped to the point where we could no longer pretend things would stabilize. The galley had stretched beans, rice, and flour as far as they could go, but bulk staples were running thin. The reactor plant was solid, but the desalination membranes were showing cracks, and the aviation crews were begging for spare parts to keep the helos flying. I knew we had to raid one of the reserve warehouses. These weren't ordinary supply depots. They were tucked away in city ports, disguised as civilian warehouses stacked with containers and shipping pallets. But in reality, they were built to hide critical naval stores. Everything from long shelf-life food to specialized gear, meant to keep ships like ours running for months without resupply. The Gerald R. Ford had left the yard fully stocked, but after 400 days of grinding operations, even a carrier can bleed out. I pulled Commander Kent into my cabin that night and laid out the problem. We couldn't keep pretending that orders were still coming down from higher if the crew's stomachs were empty and the birds on deck were grounded for lack of bolts or filters. The mask worked, but only so long as reality didn't tear it off. I told her straight that more people needed to be brought into the loop. She stared at me for a long time before asking how many. I said 5, maybe 6. Division heads I trusted, men and women who could handle the truth without letting it slip to their sailors in the wrong tone. If the lie was going to hold, it had to be reinforced by leaders who could control their people. She agreed reluctantly, but said she'd handle the search and quietly select candidates. The first step was reconnaissance. We had 1 operational drone left, a small quadrator built for short-range surveillance. It wasn't meant for heavy use, but the comms techs had adapted a portable transmitter to boost its range. Launching it had to be done carefully. If anyone on the mainland saw a drone take off from the carrier, it could draw attention we couldn't handle. We chose to launch it from the destroyer lashed alongside, using a covered maintenance bay to conceal the takeoff. The XO and I watched from CIC as the drone's camera cut through grey morning haze, banking over the ruined outlines of the port. The warehouse looked intact from the air. Corrugated metal siding still stood, and the roll-up doors were unbroken. A few of the surrounding blocks were burned-out shells, but the compound itself looked untouched. That was both good and bad. Good because it meant the supplies might still be inside. Bad because any intact structure in this world usually meant it was already occupied. The camera swept past broken vehicles, scattered debris, and what looked like drag marks cutting through the dirt leading toward one of the loading docks. No living movement was visible, but I knew better than to trust still images. I made the call to form a landing team. It would be small. 2 fire teams of Marines, 1 corpsman, and myself. I didn't trust sending anyone else to lead. If we were going into a reserve cache, the risk of discovery was too high to leave the decision-making in anyone else's hands. I wanted control, both to keep the operation from falling apart, and to make sure no one returned with the idea of pocketing loot for themselves. The XO protested at first, but she saw I wasn't moving. She settled for putting Captain Hollis, the Marine Detachment Commander, in charge of ground maneuver while I oversaw. The plan was simple on paper: insert by helo just outside the port, approach the target on foot, load what we could onto collapsible carts, then move to a cleared LZ marked earlier on drone feed. The helos would pick us up once the loads were secure. Everything would be quiet, in and out, but plans rarely last long when you put boots on the ground. We launched at first light. The helo skimmed low, skirting smoke plumes rising from other districts. From above, the city looked hollow, streets choked with rusting cars and collapsed structures. When the pilot dropped us off, the air smelled of old fires and stagnant seawater. The rot never left these places. It clung to walls, seeped into every open window. Our boots crunched glass as we moved in staggered formation down the street. No voices, no movement, just the rasp of gear and the distant creak of rusting metal. Halfway to the warehouse, things shifted. One of the Marines on point raised a fist and dropped low. Movement ahead. Not infected, at least not at first glance. 3 figures ran across the intersection, stumbling and gasping like they'd been sprinting for miles. Their clothes were shredded, skin pale and sunken, eyes wide with something that looked worse than hunger. At first we thought they were survivors, maybe people still clinging to life in the ruins. But then I saw what was behind them. A mass of infected poured from the shadows 2 blocks up. Dozens of them, maybe more, flooding the street in broken waves. They were fast, not shuffling corpses, but snapping, lunging bodies with a kind of jittering speed that turned the air electric with noise. The 3 survivors screamed when they saw our team. Instead of turning aside, they sprinted straight toward us, their arms flailing, eyes bloodshot. It took me seconds to realize what they were doing. They were leading the infected right toward the sound of our boots, toward the place where they had seen the drone days earlier. Captain Hollis shouted for restraint, but I knew what this meant. Those 3 were either already sick or desperate enough to throw us under the bus for one more day of breathing. If we let them reach us, the horde would tear through our line, and we'd never make it back to the warehouse, let alone the LZ. I gave the order to fire. The Marines opened up with controlled bursts. The 3 survivors dropped hard, sprawled across cracked pavement. Their bodies barely hit the ground before the first wave of infected tripped over them, snarling and snapping, rolling under the gunfire. The rest surged forward. We pulled back into a defensive arc, rifles hammering, casings bouncing hot against the pavement. The sound was deafening, gunfire ricocheting off concrete walls, but it was the only way to keep from being overrun. The fight lasted less than 3 minutes, but it felt longer. When the last of the infected fell twitching on the road, the air hung heavy with smoke and the smell of spent powder. One Marine vomited in the gutter, another muttered a prayer. We advanced cautiously, checking the bodies to confirm none were still moving. The 3 survivors were gone, holes punched through chests and skulls. Their plan had failed, but the cost was ours to carry. We cleared the street and pushed on toward the warehouse. Every corner felt like it could erupt again, but silence returned as sudden as the storm. When we reached the compound, the roll-up doors loomed above us, sealed tight with rusted chains. The marks on the ground confirmed what the drone had shown. Dragged crates, signs of human hands working to pry the doors. Whether those people had made it inside or died trying, I couldn't tell. What mattered was what waited behind those doors, and whether it was still worth the blood we had already spent to get here. The chains across the warehouse doors were thick with rust, but not so corroded that they would snap under a single strike. Hollis gave the signal, and 2 Marines moved forward with bolt cutters. The sound of steel grinding against steel echoed down the empty street, far louder than I wanted. Every strike seemed to carry through the ruined city like a beacon. The men worked quickly, snapping one chain, then the next, until the lock clattered to the ground. We rolled the doors up slowly, rifles aimed into the dark as dust poured out. The air smelled of mold, old grease, and the faint tang of dried blood. Inside, the warehouse stretched wide, rows of stacked pallets and sealed crates lined up in long columns. It looked untouched by fire or looters, which was a rarity. That alone told me something was wrong. Either someone had already secured this place and hadn't come back, or the infected had cleared it of anyone who tried. The Marines moved in first, sweeping their lights across the floor and corners. The sound of boots against concrete echoed in hollow beats. No immediate movement, no groans, no skittering, just the creak of metal shelving as the building shifted in the coastal wind. We split into two elements. One moved left, clearing the aisles, while I stayed with Hollis on the main walkway. We advanced slowly, rifles trained high and low, checking for any sign of recent use. Dust coated most of the crates, thick enough to suggest no one had disturbed them in months. But here and there, I noticed marks, faint scuffs in the powder, like boots had dragged across recently. A couple of the pallets near the loading dock had been cracked open. Inside were foil-sealed ration boxes. Someone had been here, but not often enough to strip it bare. The corpsman gave a soft whistle and called us over to a side room. The smell hit before I crossed the threshold. Bodies, two of them, curled against a wall, both in Navy utilities. Their skin was grey, eyes sunken, uniforms torn by bites. They had shot themselves in the head with sidearms. The brass casings lay still on the floor. A third corpse slumped in a chair, skeletal and wasted, wrists tied to the armrests with cargo straps. Its chest bore ragged holes where something had clawed through. That one hadn't been given a clean ending. I ordered the Marines to bag the sidearms and log the dog tags, then to leave the bodies where they lay. We didn't have the capacity to hold them back, and burial detail here would be suicide. We pressed deeper. The Marines found intact crates of desalinator membranes, sealed filters, and spares for small engines. That alone made the mission worth it. Beyond that, we located racks of vacuum-packed meals, thousands of them, still stacked high. Some were torn by rats, but most were solid. We marked them for retrieval. The tension lifted a fraction, but not enough. No one spoke, because everyone felt it too. A place this rich didn't stay empty without a reason. The reason revealed itself when one of the Marines cracked open a crate at the far end of the warehouse. Inside were not rations, but medical supplies. Bandages, saline, IV kits, even antibiotics. It should have been a godsend, but the moment the lid came off, the stench hit us. The crates were fouled with rot. Something had nested inside them. A low scraping sound followed, then another. From the darkness beyond the far wall, figures began to emerge, slow at first, but then faster, crawling over fallen shelves and barrels. Infected, at least 20, maybe more. Their faces twisted, skin half peeled, mouths open and raw. The Marines formed a firing line without a word. The crack of rifles exploded in the cavernous space, rounds sparking off metal beams and tearing through flesh. The echoes deafened, but the infected kept coming. They surged down the aisles, tripping over pallets, clawing through debris. One slammed against a stack of crates, knocking it over with a thunderous crash that shook the building. Dust filled the air, blinding and choking, turning the fight into chaos. I shouted orders to fall back toward the entry, keeping our fields of fire tight. Hollis led the retreat with sharp, clipped commands. The Marines fired in pairs, one shooting while the other reloaded, trading off with practiced rhythm. The corpsman dragged a wounded rifleman whose arm had been gashed open by a falling crate. Blood slicked the concrete where he had fallen, and the smell of it drove the infected into a frenzy. They sprinted faster, hurling themselves forward with no thought of self-preservation. The Marines cut them down, but every step we gained seemed to cost another magazine. By the time we reached the roll-up doors, half the warehouse behind us was filled with bodies twitching in pools of blackened blood, but the noise had drawn more. Through the side windows we could see movement in the streets, dark shapes closing in, pulled by the gunfire. We didn't have time to wait for a clean extraction. I ordered the Marines to signal the helo immediately. A strobe beacon flashed red against the sky as the pilot circled in. The thump of rotors grew closer, but so did the howls of the infected outside. We broke into two teams again, one hauling crates of rations and filters to the loading dock, the other laying down suppressive fire to keep the street clear. Every step felt like running in quicksand. weighted by gear and boxes. The first load made it to the LZ, the helo dropping to a hover as Marines hooked cargo nets beneath it. Dust whipped into our faces, and the infected poured in from the alleys, climbing over wrecked cars, slamming into the building's side. Hollis shouted for everyone to move faster, his voice nearly lost under rotor wash and rifle fire. The corpsman screamed for cover as one of the infected broke through the defensive line, lunging at him with clawed hands. A Marine tackled it and drove a knife into its skull, but not before another swarm closed in behind. We couldn't hold the line much longer. I ordered the last of the crates abandoned. Lives mattered more than supplies. We pulled the wounded aboard first, then the Marines. Then the rest of us climbed into the helo as rounds snapped past the open doors. The pilot banked hard, pulling us away from the warehouse as the infected spilled out into the street like a flood of broken bodies. From the air, the warehouse looked less like salvation and more like a trap. The stacks of supplies still sat waiting, but the building crawled with movement, every door and window slamming with infected bodies as they tore at the walls in blind rage. We had enough supplies lashed beneath the helo to keep the carrier alive for another few months. It wasn't the full haul, but it was better than nothing. Still, the cost weighed heavy. One Marine was dead, his body left behind in the warehouse. Another bled quietly against the floor of the helo, his eyes shut tight as the corpsman pressed down on his wound. When we returned to the carrier, the crew gathered to offload the supplies. Their faces lit with relief at the sight of rations and parts, but I saw the questions in their eyes too. Why so few crates? Why were there casualties if the mission had been planned so carefully? I gave them the line they needed to hear, that the mission was a success, that the supplies would keep us strong, that the men who had fallen did so to ensure the ship stayed alive. They swallowed it because they had no choice. The truth was uglier. Later, in the privacy of my cabin, Kent sat across from me. She didn't touch the food on the table. She didn't ask how much longer we could keep lying. She just said what I had already been thinking. Sooner or later, the crew would learn the truth. When they did, anger would crash over us like a tidal wave, and the mask I had built so carefully would shatter with it. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in my rack staring at the bulkhead, listening to the ship breathe, the hum of the ventilation, the distant clang of boots on metal, the faint throb of the reactors below. Normally those sounds meant order, but now they pressed against me like weights. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the face of the Marine we left behind in the warehouse. I saw the bodies twitching in the dust, and I heard the hollow cheers of the crew when we unloaded what little we had salvaged. Their relief was built on a lie, and I realized I couldn't keep stacking lie on lie forever. Kent had been right. Sooner or later the truth would break loose. Better it came from me than from whispers, or from a mission gone wrong that no amount of smooth talk could cover. I sat up before dawn and made my choice. I didn't need 5 or 6 confidants. I didn't need a circle of trusted officers to help me manage the narrative. What I needed was for everyone to hear the truth at the same time. So there was no more hiding, no more secrets, no more pretending. At 0700, I gave the order over the 1MC. All non-critical work was cancelled. Reactor, helm, and basic watch stations remained manned, but everyone else was to muster in the hangar bay. I used the excuse of honoring the dead. That was tradition, and tradition still had weight. The announcement spread fast, and by 0800, the hangar bay filled with bodies. Marines lined the walls in quiet ranks. Sailors crowded in, some still chewing rations, some whispering questions. The air was heavy with curiosity and suspicion. I walked to the front, Kent at my side, and stood on a raised platform made from stacked pallets. I didn't speak right away. I let them settle. Let the silence grow until the whispers died on their own. Then, I started with the names of the fallen from the last mission. The Marine left behind. The riflemen who bled out in the helo. I said their names and let the sound of them linger. The excuse had served its purpose. Then, I told them I would not stand here today and give them the usual line about successful operations and secure futures. I told them I was finished lying. You could feel the air change. Heads lifted, backs stiffened, some eyes narrowed. Others widened. I told them the truth as it was, not as we had wanted it to be, that there was no command structure left giving us orders. That Pacific Command had gone silent, and if there were leaders left in bunkers somewhere, they had chosen not to speak to us. I told them we had heard no authenticated signals from any US base in more than 300 days. No transmissions from NATO. Nothing from Japan, South Korea, Australia, or anywhere else. The world was not waiting for us to sail home. The world was silent, or buried, or both. I explained what we had seen on the ground, the burned-out streets of Honolulu, the corpses stacked like refuse along the piers, the empty warehouses crawling with infected that had once been men and women like us. I told them about the variations we had encountered, the slow ones, the fast ones, and the twitching things that came in bursts of speed. I told them the infection spread through blood and death itself, and that once a person turned, there was no going back. I admitted that I had falsified traffic, that the daily orders and the supposed confirmations from higher were my creation. I told them I had done it not to insult them, but to hold this ship together long enough for us to survive. I told them plainly that this did not justify me, that if anyone wanted to strip my rank from my collar and throw me overboard, I would not resist. The murmur that swept the bay was low and uncertain. No one moved, but I could feel the shift in the room as men and women realized that the mask had been stripped away. Then I gave them a choice. I said the carrier was no prison. We had boats lashed on deck, inflatable craft and life rafts. We had stores enough to spare provisions for anyone who wanted to leave. I said that in 3 days, if anyone wished to walk away from Navy discipline and from the burden of this ship, they could. We would choose a relatively safe stretch of coast, land them with arms, rations and tools, and let them search for their families or carve out whatever life they thought possible. I only asked one thing, that a single person return with the boat so the ship would not lose assets needlessly. The hangar bay erupted with sound then, voices shouting, arguing, calling questions. Some cursed me for lying. Others begged for details about their hometowns, their bases, their families. I answered what I could, but most of it was silence. I didn't know who was alive. I didn't know which cities still stood. What I knew was that none had spoken to us for almost a year. The XO stood by me without speaking, her face as hard as steel. Marines kept their hands on rifles, but didn't raise them. This wasn't a riot. It was grief finally tearing loose. Over the next 3 days, the crew wrestled with the choice. Division heads held meetings. Marines debated in their own spaces. Pilots shut themselves in ready rooms, staring at maps and photographs that no longer meant anything. I walked the decks and heard fragments of conversations. Men whispering about wives and children, women asking if their hometowns had been overrun. The crew was restless, haunted by the open door I had given them. But when the morning of the 3rd day came, and I ordered those who wished to leave to muster on deck, something remarkable happened. 300 and more walked forward. They stood apart from the rest, faces drawn, gear packed. They had chosen to leave. The silence was deafening as the others watched. I felt the weight of every step those sailors and Marines had taken. I walked to the front of the group and said that so be it. We had agreed. They would take boats, provisions and arms. But when the order came to board, when the first inflatable was unlashed and the Marines lined the gangway, something shifted. One by one, they hesitated. One by one, they looked at the sea, at the horizon, at the empty sky above, and not a single one stepped forward. It was Kent who broke the silence. She said that waiting a little longer, until we found a landing site with fewer infected, was the smarter call. Her voice cut through the uncertainty. Others echoed it. Soon the 300 who had stepped out were shaking their heads, some ashamed, some relieved, some defiant. They returned to their divisions without a word. The boats were relashed. The provisions were restowed. And I knew then that the crew, for all their anger and grief, had decided to remain. That night I stood on the bridge alone, staring at the black water slipping past the hull. We were still afloat. The mask was gone, but the ship still lived. The crew knew the truth now, and they had chosen to endure it. The silence of the world pressed in around us, heavy and absolute, but the Gerald R. Ford cut through it, a lone heartbeat in an ocean that belonged to no one anymore. The days after the revelation were uneasy, but something had shifted. With the mask gone, the crew no longer whispered about whether orders were real. They no longer second-guessed the daily briefings. Instead, they stared at the horizon with the same hard knowledge I carried, that we were alone. Yet that knowledge had a strange effect. Some divisions moved with more purpose, as if knowing the truth had cut the leash. Others became slower, heavier, weighed down by the emptiness of it all. But the ship still moved, the reactors still burned, and the flight deck still launched birds. We lived, and that counted for something. The need for a landing site pressed harder each week. The warehouse raid had bought us time, but not enough. Filters would run out again. Ammunition had dropped to levels that made me count every shot fired. Fresh water still came from the reactors, but one plant had been shut down for safety, leaving us thin if the second failed. I ordered reconnaissance along quieter stretches of coast, away from ruined cities. We looked for valleys, inlets, or small fishing harbors, anywhere that might give us a chance to land without being swarmed. The drone flights showed some promise, but each time we spotted fires, corpses, or the unmistakable jerking walk of the infected moving in clusters. One morning, radar picked up a drifting contact. The return was faint but steady, steel hull, about the size of a destroyer. We adjusted course and shadowed it for hours, letting the sea bring us closer. When the silhouette finally broke the haze, the ship's outline was clear, an Arleigh Burke class, the same type that had once sailed beside us as escort. Her mast was bent, radar domes shattered, paint scorched black down the hull. She drifted with no wake, bow pointing uselessly at the horizon. We launched a helo to hover over her decks. The camera feed showed emptiness at first, lifelines still in place, rails bent from some firefight. Then, on the aft deck near the phalanx gun, the camera caught it, the sprawl of bodies. Dozens, maybe more, most in uniform, weapons still clutched in stiff hands. A last stand. You could see it in the way the brass was scattered, in the way the corpses were piled against each other like barricades. They had fought until the end and died where they stood. We said nothing as the helo circled. Silence hung heavier than any words could carry. No one suggested boarding for survivors. There were none, but the ship still had value. Hollis and a marine team went across in respirators, stripping her for what we needed. They pulled radios, wiring, cables, even scavenged parts from her engine spaces. They found crates of small arms ammo in a forward magazine that had never been breached. Every piece was winched back to our carrier, while the dead stayed where they had fallen. When the team returned, their faces were drawn. One Marine wiped at his visor again and again, as if trying to clear the sight from his eyes. We logged the destroyer's name and coordinates, then left her to drift. 2 nights later, as we steamed south in search of calmer shores, a voice cut through the static, strong, confident, commanding. "This is Harbor Command. Secure zone established. Coordinates follow." The words repeated, steady and sure, with none of the desperation that usually bled into false calls. It was clean, rehearsed, almost too perfect. The coordinates pointed to a coastal inlet we had already overflown once, a sheltered harbor tucked between cliffs. On paper, it could have been salvation. The crew latched onto it immediately. After the truth I had given them, the thought of a safe harbor spread like fire. Men and women started talking about stepping onto land again, about finding a place to rest, about building something permanent instead of circling empty ocean. I saw it in their eyes, that flicker of hope I had tried so hard to avoid. Kent pressed me quietly. Should we answer? Should we risk it? I told her no, not yet. Instead, we tested it. At dawn, we launched the drone again, this time fitted with an improvised relay to send live feedback to CIC. The Quadrator skimmed low over the waves, then rose as it neared the harbor. At first, everything looked right. The inlet was calm, docks still standing, warehouses lining the shore. Then the feed tightened on one of the rooftops, and the lie became clear. Dozens of figures crouched along the ridgeline, rifles raised, waiting. More waited behind barricades at street level, trucks blocking exits. The call hadn't come from survivors trying to build safety. It had come from predators baiting a trap, luring desperate sailors and refugees into a kill zone. We watched in silence as the drone circled. When it drew too close, one of the men on the roof fired, and the feed went black. The crew in CIC swore under their breath. One slammed a fist against the console. Kent just shook her head. I ordered the channel cut and the coordinates marked as hostile. We said nothing to the wider crew. Some still asked me if the harbor was real. I told them we would not risk it. That was enough for now. That night I walked the decks again. The air was cool, the sea calm, but my mind wouldn't settle. We had stripped a sister ship of her bones while her crew lay silent on the deck. We had tested a voice that promised sanctuary and found only death waiting with rifles. And still the ship moved, and still the crew looked to me for decisions. The truth was out now, and yet they still clung to the structure I gave them, because structure was the only thing left between us and the abyss. The truth I had laid bare did not calm the ship. It sharpened fractures that had been slow-growing for months and gave them teeth. Within a week, the hangar decks were quieter in the mornings, not because work had stopped, but because people who had been talking in corners now stood with closed faces. The XO kept watches tighter, insisted on accountability for small deviations, and ordered a full inventory of arms and small boats. I signed off on it even though I knew that the inventory would reveal more than numbers. It would reveal priorities, who had access to weapons, and who had been thinking about leaving in the dead of night. It started with murmurs among the deck crews, arguments about who had priority for the limited fresh water, who had the right to the better sleeping cots on the carrier's island superstructure. Then, someone spread word that the Admiral had lied for months. That was true, and it stung, but it was not what broke the balance. What broke the balance was the idea that if there was no higher authority, anyone could claim authority. A boatswain's mate gathered a group of men, sailors from a supply division, a few who had been stripped of their liberty for small thefts, and an ambitious petty officer who had always wanted command. They planned to seize the armory at night, overwhelm the Marine Guard, cut loose the small boats, and go for the nearest headland that rumors said still had fishers and a supply of diesel. They had maps, a list of watch rotations, and one of them even had a keycard he'd taken from a sleeping corporal months before. Word of the plan reached my ears in the early morning hours, not through a single report but through small signs. The wrong watch at the wrong station, one of the supply locks left ajar, a Marine who found a stolen wrench in his locker. I did not confront the group openly. I ordered a discreet sweep. Master-at-Arms Chief Kowalski and his team moved at dawn and took the men before the plan could be set in motion. In the brig they were defiant. The boatswain's mate talked fast, arguing that I had no right to keep them when the rest of the world had failed them. He said my lie had been a theft of choice, that I had stolen their right to decide whether to live under orders. He spat the words and looked at every man in the cell as if waiting for them to rise. Nobody rose. The mutiny had the sound of bravado and the shape of a desperate attempt, but it did not have enough teeth to take the ship. We held a summary court that same day. The legal officer read charges in a room full of chairs and faces, and I sat with the XO at the head of the table. The men were given an opportunity to explain. They did not deny the plan. They argued about motive and necessity. The Naval Code still had provisions for mutiny and for sedition in wartime. I did not relish the thought of taking lives. In the long years of my career I had watched courts and panels and the slow grinding of justice. But this was not a peacetime problem. This was an island of steel in the middle of an ocean where the rules had been ground down to the point of marrow. The legal officer recommended punitive measures calibrated to the risk: confinement, reduction in rate, loss of privileges, and for the ringleader, because he had the plan, because he had tried to seize weapons, because his action would have risked the entire ship, capital punishment. I made the call I had hoped I would not have to make. I signed the orders, and we scheduled the execution at first light the next day. On the fantail, under a pale sky and a single flag, Marines loaded the man into position. The chaplain came forward and asked if he had last words. He did not. He stared at the horizon until the orders were given. I read the charges out loud into a microphone so the rest of the ship could hear. Attempted mutiny, attempted seizure of government property, intent to endanger a vessel of the United States. The formation of Marines fired a volley at my command. The men who pulled the triggers did their duty with faces that did not look triumphant. They looked stitched together from duty and grief. We dealt with the other conspirators by confinement, hard labor, and restricted rations. The brig filled with men who would take months to unmake and years to forgive. After the execution, the ship changed in small ways. Some crew members left their racks in the middle of the night to stand at the rail and speak into their sleeves. Others drifted toward the mess and pretended to eat, not tasting a thing. The XO stood by me, silent for long stretches, and the chaplain kept a ledger of names that he read at quarterdeck every Sunday. I told no one on the ship that at night I sat alone and imagined the man's mother, wherever she might be, and how she would one day hear that her son had been executed at sea. I told no one that I wondered if moral authority had a cost that required blood to keep it alive. Those questions had no answer that would keep us alive, so I put them away. Then the other ship came out of the haze. We had been running patrols along a line we hoped would keep us out of known traffic lanes, but the ocean is wide and ships are not always where you expect them to be. The radar picked up a contact that registered as a medium-sized warship. We launched a reconnaissance plane, an FA-18 stripped to basic surveillance configuration with cameras and extra fuel tanks. The pilot was set to make a high pass and not to land. The plane went aloft and banked out over the sea, the carrier's deck crew watching the takeoff like they used to watch parades. For a moment we held breath and formality both. We needed to know if this hull was friend or foe. We needed to know if there were other naval forces out there that had survived and might offer an organized coalition. The live feed came back grainy at first, then clearer as the plane closed on the contact. From 10,000 feet the ship looked like it had been through a furnace. Holes riddled the hull, burn marks traced along the superstructure, and smoke still curled from one of the coronas. The closer the plane came, the more detail the camera captured. It was not sailors in crisp uniforms moving about the deck. It was the ragged outline of people with old gear, makeshift armor, and weapons held loosely in hands. Their faces were smeared with dirt and black soot. From the banked angle we could see small arms fire erupt along the rail, not in a coordinated drill, but in scattered bursts. The plane's camera followed a group dragging something, barrels or supplies, across the deck. There were no flags. There was no call sign. Whoever had once crewing that ship had been replaced by something else that moved like a military force, but acted like a ragged militia. The pilot reported an attempt to raise identification over secure channels and got no valid response. The ship answered instead with a hail that used a call sign we did not recognize, but it sounded like a parody of naval discipline. Too loud, too confident, and oddly rehearsed. I sent Kent to evaluate the feed while the plane circled at a higher altitude to stay out of range of small arms. The drone camera that the Marines had launched earlier also provided a close-up from different angles. It showed men pointing what looked like rifle barrels down at the water and pulling triggers at the aircraft. My gut told me this was likely a provocation, a trap to draw us near so they could claim salvage or to test our reaction. I weighed two options in the space of seconds: close and send a boarding party, or keep distance and neutralize the threat. Boarding had appeal. Salvage the hull, maybe find working radios and effective crew. But boarding meant putting men in harm's way against a force that looked organized enough to set an ambush. Neutralizing meant firing weapons at a hull that might once have been ours, but now was not. Neutralizing would cost lives. I made the decision that night. The ship's safety demanded that we take no unnecessary risk. I authorized the plane to mark targets and to stand by with precision munitions. I ordered the destroyer escort to prepare torpedo tubes for potential engagement. The carrier's weapons officer, the one who had kept his composure through things that made other men shout, confirmed we had anti-ship torpedoes ready. We did not fire them lightly. We coordinated the plan in a room none of the crew entered, a metal box of charts and voices. The pilot, at my direction, launched one air-launched anti-ship missile against a visible weapons mount on the superstructure and provided a laser-designated point for the ship to follow if further action was required. The missile struck the mount and knocked a section of the superstructure loose. No one on our bridge cheered. We had just broken the hull of a ship that had once been a symbol of a nation. We had also stopped a potential threat. The destroyer fired 2 torpedoes next, a decision made with dry procedural language and a gravity that did not need to be rehearsed. The torpedoes hit low along the waterline and punched holes that took the enemy ship off her feet. She listed hard, smoke pouring from her vents and deck. The drone feed showed people scrambling, firing still, but the coordinated action we had seen earlier dissolved into scattered panic. We watched the deck flood and heard the pilot say, "Hull's going under." The decision had been final. We had given no quarter because we could not risk our people to what might have been a trap. I thought about the men and women who had once served aboard that ship in proper uniforms, the way careers form and break in peacetime. The sight of that deck flooding did not make me feel better. It made me feel the weight of command down to the marrow. The pilot relayed one last frame from his camera before he broke off the orbit. An old patch on the hull, half burnt, with a worn emblem no one on our ship could place. It might have been a name. It might have been nothing. The ocean swallowed the wreck and with it any chance of salvage. We logged the coordinates and moved on with tightened watches. After that, the crew's nerve frayed further. Some sailors argued that I had been too quick to fire, that we could have boarded, could have rescued any survivors, could have taken the ship as a prize of war. Others said I had acted to protect them, and that I had shown resolve in a world that no longer had rules. The brig filled with new prisoners, men who had tried to take advantage of the chaos after the strike, men who had taken guns without report, men who had tried to barter with outside groups for safe passage off the carrier. Discipline had to be firm, because without it we would pull apart. But with each enforcement, the distance between command and crew lengthened in ways I did not fully understand. They needed to see that justice was not arbitrary, and I needed to be careful that it didn't look like vengeance. We continued our search for a quieter coast. The drone flights and the plane sorties mapped stretches of shoreline that might harbor survivors, or at least offer places to land with minimal contact. One such place was a medium-sized coastal city that had once been busy with trade and commerce. From the air, it looked like it had been abandoned in haste. Shop fronts with shutters still down, cars left at odd angles, a shopping district empty beneath a haze of dust. The city's naval facility, a former forward operating base, still had pier structures intact in satellite images, and the drone showed a low profile of movement on the docks that could have been wind, fishing nets, or people. We plotted a course to bring us close enough so the helicopters could do low-level recon, and if possible, land scouts on shore. On the approach, we tightened force protection. Helicopters would fly with supporting aircraft overhead, and Marines went through rehearsed insertion drills. Our plan was not to make a show of power, but to move quietly, to insert a scout element, get a read on the situation, and then either expand or withdraw. I ordered the deck closed and standing by, and I watched every man and woman prepare. The air smelled of fuel and felt charged with the sting of expectation. The crew watched the shoreline appear on the bridge screens like men craning for a familiar thing. For some, the sight of the city was a map to memory. For others, it was a question without an answer. We lowered helos into clean hover, checked thermal signatures twice, and sent small teams ashore. They moved with the predictability of profession: clear, cover, communicate. Yet each man and woman who stepped onto that pavement carried the knowledge that the first wrong move could mean death. The city was quieter than the ruins of Honolulu. There were signs of recent habitation in places, fresh fire pits, improvised barricades, a radio antenna propped atop a collapsed bus. We found shops with shelves still half-stocked, refrigerators long dead but canned goods intact, and a small medical clinic with bandages and an oxidizer unit intact. On the base docks we found scorched vehicles and the remains of what looked like a perimeter fight, spent casings, blood dried on concrete, a few pieces of marine insignia in tatters. No organized team held the base, but pockets of people had tried to defend it and failed. The scouts radioed back assessments, and I listened to each report with my pen hovering over a log. We assessed supply potential, explored risk corridors, and weighed whether to move a larger force ashore. There were choices embedded in every piece of information we gathered: send a larger force and risk becoming bogged down in a place that might be a trap. leave almost immediately, and forgo a chance to replenish supplies that could buy us months more at sea, or try to establish a small outpost and see if a workable relationship with whoever remained on shore could be built. The ship and her people had to decide, but the decision would not be easy. I could see the faces of my crew on the bridge screens and in the hangar bay, and knew whatever choice we made would shape the path we walked from that moment forward. We made the decision in the early morning hours. The risk was there no matter what, but the cost of staying at sea with dwindling supplies was higher. We would establish a foothold on land, and that foothold would be the old naval base outside the city. I ordered the destroyer to move in first, mooring her alongside the battered piers. Marines and deckhands rigged lines, tested cleats, and walked the length of cracked concrete that had once seen years of resupply. The Gerald R Ford remained farther out to sea, her silhouette a grey shadow beyond the horizon, close enough to provide air cover but far enough to maneuver if anything went wrong. We cleared the docks building by building. Marines stacked up, pushed through doorways, and swept rooms with practiced discipline. Most were empty, some cluttered with old blood and broken gear, a few crawling with infected that had to be put down before we could hold ground. By the end of the week, we had secured a perimeter around the base's main warehouses and command offices. I ordered several helicopters staged ashore to reduce turnaround time, their crews billeted in the intact hangars. For the first time in more than a year, Navy aircraft sat ready on solid ground instead of a pitching deck. Once the base was stable, I stood before the crew again. I reminded them of the promise I had made during the hangar assembly, that anyone who wanted to leave, truly leave, would have the chance. I told them the door was open now, 1 weapon each and a week's worth of rations. I gave them a day to decide. The next morning fewer than 50 stood apart from the others. Some said they still had family somewhere inland. Others said they simply could not live under discipline anymore. I let them go without anger. Those who decided to leave packed their stuff, weapons, and a week's food supply. Some honored us. Some didn't even look back, and some stared in our direction before leaving. Whether they found what they wanted or met the same fate as so many others, we would never know. The month that followed changed everything. For the first time since the outbreak began, we were no longer ghosts drifting in an empty ocean. Smoke rose from our chimneys. The sound of rotors echoed inland, and people noticed. Civilians began to appear. At first it was ones and twos, men and women in ragged clothes, holding makeshift flags above their heads to show they carried no arms. Then they came in groups of 10, then 20. Some had followed rumors of planes and helicopters, words that carried authority in a world where only silence had reigned. Others had picked up our radio signals and believed, against all logic, that the United States Navy still stood watch. They approached with awe and with fear. To them, we looked like the return of the old world, uniforms and aircraft and steel hulls lined against the horizon. Not all who came meant well. Raiders tried their hand. A band of 20 approached at night in stolen military vehicles, firing wildly at the perimeter. They were cut down quickly by Marines with night optics and interlocking fire. Another group posed as civilians, waving white rags and begging for food, until one reached for a concealed weapon. That too ended in blood. We buried the bodies in shallow graves beyond the wire and doubled watches afterward. Discipline was the only reason the base did not collapse before it started. Infection remained a constant shadow. Several times patrols stumbled upon nests of infected clustered in ruined shops or gutted apartment buildings. We organized burn teams. Marines with flamethrowers built from modified fuel rigs. Engineers with fire hoses converted to carry accelerants. We cleared block by block, burning nests and collapsing floors where necessary. The smell hung for days, acrid and unforgettable, but it brought us safety. The largest operation came when scouts found more than 100 of the creatures packed into a schoolhouse, slamming against the walls until they broke free. We ringed the building with fire and watched it burn through the night, rifles ready for anything that stumbled out. Nothing did. Despite the violence, life returned in small ways. We organized work crews of sailors and civilians, repairing roofs, wiring lights, and restoring water pumps. Helicopters ferried salvage from surrounding towns, fuel cans, tools, batteries, and anything that could be turned into infrastructure. The destroyer provided a constant lifeline, its holds filled with parts stripped from other wrecks. The carrier remained offshore as both shield and sword, her aircraft flying high cover during every mission. Slowly, the naval base turned from a hollow ruin into something resembling a stronghold. By the end of the third month, more than 100 civilians lived inside the wire alongside the crew. Farmers from the inland hills, dock workers from nearby towns, and families who had survived in basements now stood shoulder to shoulder with Marines in morning musters. Children laughed when helicopters lifted off, covering their ears, but smiling all the same. A few men even volunteered to stand perimeter watch, handed rifles by Marines who trained them in the basics. It was not the Navy as it had been, but it was order, and order meant survival. Every week brought new challenges. Supply shortages forced rationing again. A fever spread through the civilian population and threatened to overwhelm the small medical staff until we secured antibiotics from a looted hospital. A raider band tried to sneak into the settlement disguised as civilians, but were caught when one of them failed to remove an ammunition belt under his coat. We executed them publicly, because mercy in that moment would have signaled weakness. The civilians saw it and did not protest. They understood the price of safety. The most difficult day came when a group of infected breached a weak point in the outer fence during a night storm. They tore through 2 shacks before Marines could regroup and cut them down. 5 civilians were killed, and panic spread like fire. The next morning, I walked the perimeter myself and stood where the bodies lay. I told the assembled civilians and crew that this was not the end of the settlement, that fear was natural but paralysis was death. We rebuilt the fence that day with steel plating taken from wrecked vehicles, and by nightfall the wire gleamed in the floodlights. Through all of this, I thought about the decision I had made back on the carrier when I told the crew the truth. That choice had cost me authority in one sense, but it had bought me something deeper. Now the men and women here followed me not because they believed orders came from a distant command post, but because they knew I would tell them what was real. That honesty bound them tighter than any illusion ever had. Months passed, and the base hardened into a true stronghold. Patrols pushed out in wider arcs. Fields were cleared for cultivation. A workshop opened in the old motor pool, welding scrap into tools and weapons. Civilians started keeping ledgers of supplies, teaching children to read, repairing broken radios to listen for distant signals. We had become more than a warship at sea. We had become a settlement, a community, and maybe the beginnings of a remnant of what the country had been. I knew the danger was not gone. Infected still roamed. Raiders still scouted. The silence of the wider world remained. But for the first time since the outbreak, I could stand on solid ground and see a flag rising above something that lived. The Gerald R Ford still floated offshore, steel and power waiting for the day she might be called to sail again. The base still burned lights into the night, a signal of life to anyone watching. And the people, sailors, Marines, and civilians alike, still stood shoulder to shoulder, proving that even at the edge of the world, order could be built again if men and women had the will to hold it. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep the stories alive. For now, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and stay alive. Jack's Nightmares, signing off. Until next time, survivor.